Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our 11th talk in the CPR Land Rights Initiative Speakers Series. So a very warm welcome to all of you who are in this room, as well as all who are joining us on Facebook Live today. It is both my pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Mo Banerjee, who will be talking to us today about Gau Raksha, the cow life controversy and the Bengali Muslim public sphere in the late 19th century. Dr. Mo Banerjee received her PhD in modern South Asian history from Harvard this year. Her dissertation thesis is titled Questions of Faith, Christianity, Conversion and the Ideological Origins of Political Theology in Colonial India from 1813 to 1907. Mo received the Harold K. Gross Dissertation Prize, which is awarded each year at graduation to the PhD recipient whose dissertation, in the opinion of a committee of department members, gives greatest promise of a distinguished career of historical research. Many congratulations, Mo. Mo's research examines conversion to Protestant Christianity and explains how this issue emerged as the earliest and important locus of public debate, social reform, and anti-colonial resistance in colonial India in the 19th and early 20th century. Mo is currently a college fellow at Harvard, but will join Clemson University as assistant professor of history from the fall of 2018. Mo also holds bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature from Jadavpur University in India. So a very warm welcome to you, Mo. The CPR Land Rights Initiative Speaker Series was started a few years ago to create an institutional space for inviting diverse perspectives on land rights issues from various stakeholders, by which I mean perspectives both on the political economy of legal and extra-legal conflicts over land in the present-day context, as well as the social and political history of such conflicts. Mo's talk is marks many firsts for the speaker series. It's the first talk by a historian in the series, and will reflect on the discourse around Gau Raksha in the Bengali Muslim public sphere in the backdrop of growing Hindu-Muslim conflict following the enactment of the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885. Since this talk is being recorded and also being put out on Facebook Live, I would request you all to hold your questions until the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mo and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank you so much, Namita, for inviting me. It's, again, both my pleasure and privilege to be here at CPR today and to talk to all of you about Gau Raksha and the Bengali Muslim public sphere. I'm very glad that I could be here, and without further ado, if I may, start the paper. The title of the paper is Gau Raksha, the Cow Life Controversy and the Bengali Muslim Public Sphere 1889 to 1890. And let's just talk about what the contours of this controversy were. The Bengali Muslim periodical, Shudhakar, published from Calcutta, reported on a large protest assembly at Dhaka on Friday afternoon of 1st November 1889. Students and teachers from Dhaka College, Dhaka Madrasa, the Jubilee and Jagannath institutions, as well as from the Survey, medical and normal schools were in attendance. Many, though not all of them, were scholars of Islam. They were there in solidarity and sympathy with a man called Maulvi Naimuddin Sahib, the editor of the newspaper Akhbar-e-Islamia, published from Tangail in eastern Bengal, which is now in Bangladesh. Naimuddin was a target of a defamation lawsuit instituted by the most well-known of Bengali Muslim authors of the age, Mir Musharraf Hussain. Speaking at the assembly, the professor of Arabic at Dhaka Madrasa, a man called Maulvi Hafiz Abdullah, said, "If someone bearing the name of a Muslim conspires to please an unbeliever, and in such a circumstance a truly faithful Musliman stands against this corrupted man, only to find himself imperiled in an unequal fight, that is a danger for the entire community and the nation." In the background of this groundswell of public support for Maulvi Naimuddin was the Go Jiban or cow life controversy, which was described in Bengali as a Jatiyo Bipod or national calamity. In this paper, I argue that the cow life controversy, debated and performed in the public sphere through Musalmani Bengali periodicals and pamphlets provides a rare insight into the process of formation of political identities and networks of information exchange revolving around a socio-religiously inflicted issue at a non-elite level. I also argue that the lawsuit that resulted due to the controversy provides an important background towards the genealogy of later legal juxtaposition of religious critique and criminal intent to defame an imagined community of faith, which would be brought into sharp relief by the infamous Rangila Rasool case of 1927. Mir Musharraf Hussain, who was born in 1847 and 1912, the protagonist of this controversy, belonged to an Ashraf or aristocratic Sayyid family from the district of Kushtia in eastern Bengal. Some of you might know that as the Zamindari of the Tagore family. He was a pioneering author of the Musalman Bengali novel genre, having written a trilogy called Bishad Sindhu or Sea of Sorrows, which described the tragic events surrounding the Battle of Karbala in Bengali. The trilogy garnered critical praise, but more interestingly, it became a substitute for the Quran in many Bengali households. The Quran had been translated into Bengali by the Brahmo preacher Bhai Girish Sen, who worked tirelessly from 1881 to 1886 to publish this version. However, because of its price, even the Bengali translation was not available to most Bengali Muslims. The tenets of Islam in Bengal circulated through folk literature and novels, from Sayyid Sultan's Nabi Vangsha on the descendants of the Nabi, that is Prophet Muhammad, written in the 16th century, to Mir Musharraf Hussain's novel Bishad Sindhu, which I have talked about, published in 3 volumes in 1885, 1887, and 1891. However, Musharraf Hussain had begun his career as a journalist and contributor to the periodicals Shangbad Prabhakar and Grambarta Prakashika, one published from Calcutta and the other from Tangail, and he remained until the end a chronicler of the life and times of Eastern Bengali Muslims, largely peasants. His connections to popular print media resulted in the sharp journalistic observations of changes in Bengali society in the latter half of the 19th century. He penned a series of articles in the Ahmadi periodical in 1888, exhorting fellow Muslims to forego cow slaughter and sacrifice in a bid to advocate for intercommunal peace. The articles were collected and published by him in the pamphlet form as Go Jiban or Cow Life hyphenated. Controversy erupted as soon as the editorials were published, and the essay was quickly denounced as un-Islamic by Maulavi Naimuddin and other members of the Bengali ulema. The catalyst to the most controversial episode of Musharraf Hussein's life was the establishment of Go Rakshani or cow protection movements by Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj in 1881-82. As analyzed by Jnanendra Pandey, Anand Yang, and more recently Rohit Dey and others, the cow protection movement led to escalation of communal tensions in North and East India in the 1880s. Musharraf Hussain was keenly attuned to the rising political and social disharmony in Bengal. 2 important factors need to be considered while analyzing the cultural spaces of Muslim apologetics in Eastern Bengal during this period. First, a man called Nayamia, the leader of a peasant movement called the Faraidi movement, died while on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1884. He had led the last successful charge, politically, economically, and ideologically, against the forces of Hindu zamindari extortion of the Muslim peasantry in eastern Bengal. Nayamia's death left a vacuum in the rural Bengali Muslim ecumene in the sphere of Islamic reform and theological debate. The second factor was the social and economic changes wrought by the passage of the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885, which pitted Hindu landlords against Muslim riots. After a series of rent strikes by the peasantry, resulting in disturbances, the deposition of the landlords, largely high caste Hindus, failed to convince the colonial British administration of the wisdom of non-interference in the settled relationship between Rayat and Zamindar that had gone on since 1793 and the permanent settlement. The Bengal Tenancy Act invested the Rayats, as Sugato Bose mentions in his seminal work on peasant labor, with, and I quote, right to land with substance and security. With the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885 and a corresponding withering of zamindari rights to land, the Muslim peasantry found a new economic and social stability. 1885, then, was the final closing of a kind of political and economic possibility for the Muslim peasantry and the opportunity for new articulations of rights and reforms. This cannot be discounted in the flowering of subaltern discourses on religion, culture, social hierarchies, and resistance against suspected efforts at depredations of social cohesion, largely through evangelical Christian missionary activity, which I have written about elsewhere. Recent historiography on liberalism and empire privileges a materialist understanding of liberalism based on right to property and the Bengali Muslim politics of peasant independence deriving and evolving out of that right. Andrew Sartori, for example, analyzes proprietary rights to land held customary by the ryots, but he, I think, paints a partial picture of Muslim peasant political agitation. Beginning with the figure of Titumir in the early 19th century through the Faraidis who I have talked about, to the distinctive approach of Musharraf Hussain towards communitarian cohesion, religion and religious identity played just as important a role in defining self and other in Bengal, and agitation for land rights by the peasants was deeply imbued with a sense of religious fervor. It was just as important to be a good Musalman, as my story shows, as it was to be a good cultivator, that Sartori has demonstrated in his analysis. Defining the parameters of being a good and true Muslim demarked the lines of political and social agitation, where religion and right to property were interwoven, proximate, and omnipresent strands. The conditions of faith, therefore, in rural Bengal were riven with tensions. Such tensions were effectively expressed intra-communally as well, as in not only between Hindus and Muslims, but within the Muslims of Bengal as well. After having been afforded the legal right of the individual to property, it is possible that Bengali Muslims turned their attentions towards a better definition of themselves as subjects and citizens. The category of reform, both most intimately accessible to them and offering the most viable potential for resistance, was religion. In this, three major religions had to be considered. Their own, which was a uniquely Bengali Islam or South Asian Islam, which their reformers saw as hopelessly syncretic and muddled. The second was the Hinduism of their immemorial neighbors, usages borrowed from which had apparently led to the pollution of their own social rights and customs. And last and most externally threatening, the unstated but omnipresent faith of the colonial imperial state and its official and non-official members, Christianity, which the Bengali Muslims viewed with suspicion as a tool of erasure of their identity. It was an atmosphere of rapid change, compounded by ecological disaster and socio-religious disarray, and we can talk about what these are, and the increasing intrusion of the colonial state, both officially and unofficially, into the lives of Bengali Muslims. So I just want to discuss briefly Mir Musharraf Hussein's arguments against cow slaughter and the responses it drew from Naimuddin, the Akbar-e-Islamia, the Shudhakar group, and a man called Riazuddin Mashaddi. These arguments against cow slaughter for either celebratory or religious reasons took three different angles. The first was about the limits of Quranic sanction of animal sacrifice and appropriate substitutions that could be offered instead of beef. The second argument was about social cohesion and respecting the religious and cultural sensibilities of Bengali Hindus. And the third argument was a combination of economic and medical reasons against cow slaughter. All these arguments should sound very familiar to the audience members. In terms of textual sanction in the Quran of animal sacrifice, largely in the second surah, Musharraf Hussein's argument was simply this: just because certain animals were marked as halal, it did not mean the injunction was for mandatory consumption of the meat of those animals. In his opinion, the limit was the prohibition and not the permission. For example, wild boar could not be eaten at the peril of eternity in Jahannam. Cow was permissible, but it did not mean beef had to be compulsorily ingested. Musharraf Hussain made a point of insisting that cow sacrifice during Eid and other celebrations had as much to do with cultural norms and performance of social prestige for Bengali Muslims as it had ostensibly to do with religious observance. For example, he said, cow sacrifice was almost unknown in Arabia, where camel sacrifice was far more popular. Bengalis, of course, almost never sacrificed camel for understandable reasons, since camels were pretty rare in Bengal. Therefore, cows could be substituted by a number of other animals, including goats, and the pious devotional intent behind the sacrifice would not be lessened at all. The argument about social cohesion was that if there were no overt religious sanctions against the prohibition of cow slaughter, Bengali Muslims should, as a matter of respect for their immemorial neighbors, the Hindus, refrain from making beef eating a performance of social eminence and an article of faith. Musharraf Hussain here depended on a sketch of the ability of his faith to adapt to a very different social and political regimes. He said that Islam, by crossing mountains and deserts, had unfurled its flag over Hindustan, but in the process had also adapted to its environs. This adaptability was historically documented. Surely this reasoning could be extended to allow substitution of animals other than cows for sacrifice, animals which were not tied as closely to the religious sensibilities of the Hindus. The third argument centered on many different economic uses of cows. Musharraf Hussain added the environmental aspect of Bengal's weather and the medical suitability of eating beef, which he said was difficult to digest with very few discernible health benefits, to the diet of Bengali Muslims. Contemporary opinions about the proverbial weakness of Bengali stomachs aside, as in we cannot digest anything we eat, Musharraf Hussain pointed out that in their daily diet, comprising largely of rice, lentils, vegetables, and milk, Bengali Hindus and Muslims did not really differ very much from each other. No one could enjoy the rich preparations demanded by beef, more suitable for the drier North Indian climate, as a daily component of their Bengali food. In fact, daily consumption of beef in Bengal's very humid and hot climate would result in ailments ranging from dyspepsia and gout to leprosy. He went on to say, and this is where he's skirting the lines of blasphemy, it was God himself who had made common sense an arbiter of human action, and God who had mandated differing diets according to different climatic conditions. If beef eating was such a central factor in the true observance of Islam, God would not have filled Bengal with greenery, with fruits and vegetables, and rivers teeming with fish. As should be clear from the arguments Musharraf Hussain was presenting, the foundation of his desire for prohibition of cow slaughter was one based on rational, logical interpretation of religious observances based on material conditions of the daily life of Bengali Muslims. The concept of independent reasoning, or ijtihad, was attracting increasingly urgent new debates in northern Indian elite Muslim societies, primarily through Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and his Aligarh reform movement. Musharraf Hussain was motivated by the communal rights and tensions exacerbated by the Raksha movement in Bengal, which was spearheaded by some men like Sriman Swami, who was, as the colonial administrators noted, a charlatan and a rabble-rouser, as well as other cow protectionists, both Arya Samajists and high caste Orthodox Hindus, including many of the zamindars. However, it is not unreasonable to conjecture that Musharraf Hussein's position on cow slaughter controversy sought support in the use of ijtihad as it was beginning to be used to discuss the condition of Muslims in British India, who, after the census of 1872, suddenly found that they lived in a close relationship with a newly demographically defined Hindu majority population. So let's talk about the backlash against Musharraf Hussain now. The backlash was instantaneous. The first attack came from Tangail by Maulvi Naimuddin, who accused Musharraf Hussain straight up of apostasy. The editorial published a point-by-point rebuttal of Gojivan's arguments, which is the pamphlet that Musharraf Hussain had published, beginning with his contention that it was necessary for the sake of social cohesion and normalization of tensions between Hindus and Muslims that cow slaughter needed to be voluntarily banned by the Bengali Muslim community. According to Naimuddin, the argument was not only deeply flawed, but actually a blasphemous one. There could be no higher consideration than the belief in and the fulfillment of the tenets of one's faith. The fact that the sacrifice of cows and the eating of beef was halal for Muslims meant that there were no other factors important enough to merit the reconsideration of that permission. In other words, permissions and prohibitions were equally important and equally binding upon believing Muslims to observe. Musharraf Hussain, by placing social and communal relationships with Hindus, who did not belong to the community of the people of the book, the Ahl-e Kitab, above the textual and customary sanctions admitted by Islam, had proclaimed his own apostasy. The place of humor and satire which Musharraf Hussain had introduced in his articles, were another admission of apostasy, since true faith should not be made an object of laughter by the ignorant. One who brought the true faith into disrepute by the use of such low means was a kafir. The use of terminology was suspect as well. Musharraf Hussain had used the Bengali word bolidan instead of kurbani for sacrifice throughout his pamphlet, which showed, Naimuddin said, that prolonged and close contact with Hindus had corrupted his identity as a true Muslim. And of course, Musharraf Hussain's belief that cow sacrifice could be substituted by sacrifices of other permissible animals, such as goats, came under the greatest fire. If cows were on the brink of extinction because Muslims of India insisted on sacrificing them for religious reasons and regularly ate beef even though the climatic conditions were inclement for such a diet, Naimuddin asked why Musharraf Hussain did not write another article against the Hindus and their sacrificial practices involving goats, which was surely leading to the extinction of all ungulates. He made the same argument about buffaloes, in fact. Naimuddin ended his diatribe with a clear threat against Musharraf Hussain, that of excommunication from society. He also piously advised Hussain to do the tawbah and return to his original faith. Naimuddin did not stop with the editorials. He organized a meeting in Tangail town, where Musharraf Hussain lived, on 17th August 1889, in the presence of the Qazi, a man called Sultan Ahmed, and the sub-deputy magistrate, Saifuddin, in the presence of the elite members of Tangail's Muslim society, to which Musharraf Hussain belonged. Naimuddin proclaimed Musharraf Hussain a kafir again, and declared that his relationship with his beloved wife was haram and null, since marriage between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim or a kafir was inadmissible. All of this was done without directly taking Musharraf Hussein's name, but given that Hussain was actually present at this assembly in person, and enough heavy hints had been given to give away the identity of the apostate completely, he left the assembly deeply humiliated. He immediately wrote a letter to the Akhbar-e-Islamia, which Naimuddin edited, letting them know that he took the threats and insults as a direct attempt at defaming him and terrorizing his family. The comments had injured his feelings and his standing in society. As such, if an apology from Naimuddin and Qazi Sultan Ahmed was not printed in the Akhbar-e-Islamia in its next edition, with a copy mailed to Musharraf Hussein's lawyer Horochandra Chakraborty, a Brahmin, at the Tangail Munsif court, Musharraf Hussain would institute a case of criminal defamation against them both. Since no such apology seemed to be forthcoming at all, the defamation case was lodged in due course, attracting a new wave of calumny against Musharraf Hussain. The Akhbar-e-Islamia reported that if young students went to Musharraf Hussain to ask for free copies of the Gojivan, he was apparently making them swear on the Quran that they would not eat beef ever again in their entire lives. And this was a complete rumor. It was also alleged, if you will, it was an alternative fact, that the Arya Samajists from the Gorakshani Sabha of Allahabad were actually bearing the legal expenses of defamation suit on behalf of Musharraf Hussain, who had of course written his editorials after being paid by them to vilify Bengali Muslims. This rumor possibly stemmed from the fact that the cow protection movement in Bengal quickly seized on Musharraf Hussein's articles as a viable propaganda material against the Bengali Muslim community, given that it had been authored by one of the most illustrious members of the Muslim intellectual elite. The copy of the Gojivan that I used for this paper was deposited at the Bagbaja Reading Library in Calcutta, and it contains an endorsement from Sriman Swami, the man who led the Gorakshani movement in Calcutta, as its frontispiece, and it's dated 1889. Swami praised Musharraf Hussain as a truly good man and an able servant of the Hindu community, and encouraged him to keep writing about the issue. He also invited Musharraf Hussain to become an advisor to the leaders of the cow protection movement in Bengal. Such provocation, of course, immediately incensed the opponents of Musharraf Hussain, who also imputed that the Hindus of Tangail were actually sending him heaps of money. The Akhbar-e-Islamia asked true Muslims to risk their lives in protecting Bengali Muslim society and save the true faith in Bengal. The language makes it very clear that they wouldn't be very troubled if someone were to rid the earth of the novelist. It was at this time that the Shudhakar, published from Calcutta, the metropolitan center and the capital of India at this point, took up the cause of Maulvi Naimuddin against Musharraf Hussain and turned this into a cause célèbre in the metropolitan center. It printed excerpts from the cross-examination from the ongoing trial regarding the defamation suit, but only selectively. Only those sections of the transcript were printed where the plaintiff's witness was forced to accept that in certain sections of the Gojivan, Musharraf Hussain had, strictly speaking, skirted the line of blasphemy. A short example of the cross-examination should suffice, and I'm quoting. Question. In the Gojivan, is it not clear that the author wrote the pamphlet in an effort to gain trust, respect, and material benefits from the Hindus? Can we not say that this desire led him to vilify Muslims and unjustly interfere in the rituals and practices of Islamic faith? Witness. Yes, such an inference can probably be drawn. In my opinion, certainly some unjust interferences have been made. Question. If any true believer in Islam undertook such vilification and satire of the Islamic faith, could they or could not they be counted as apostate, kafir? Witness. If you insist, yes, that person is a kafir. Naimuddin was portrayed as a true defender of the faith and of the Muslim community. He was old, infirm, poverty-stricken. He was only rich in his learning of Islamic scriptures. The elite Musharraf Hussain, a Sayyid, a member of the Bengali Ashraf, was unjustly tormenting this man, who had only protested against Musharraf Hussein's transgressive and corrupted understanding of the Quran. The Sudhakar printed anonymous letters from the well-wishers of Naimuddin from all over Bengal, and when Musharraf Hussain and his brothers stopped their subscription to the Sudhakar, it printed the news as evidence of their impious, intolerant, elitist, and repressive characters. Musharraf Hussain had to write to the Akhbar-e-Islamia, protesting this incessant harassment and reaffirming over and over again his true faith as a Mussalman. He also refused to accept the Akhbar-e-Islamia as any kind of monolithic, any kind of spokesman for an imagined monolithic Bengali Muslim society, and strongly refuted their demands that he should burn the existing copies of the Gojivan. As the defamation suit drew to an inevitable negotiated settlement in 1890, with Naimuddin apologizing to Musharraf Hussain in writing and asking the court's indulgence in forgiving him the money demanded by Musharraf Hussain, the embers were stoked again by Riyazuddin Mashaddi, prominent Islamic scholar and contributor to the Sudhakar. In his pamphlet Agni Kukkut or Firebird, published in 1890 from Calcutta, he saw symptoms of a greater malaise of social disharmony instituted by the cow protection movement, that of Hindu majoritarianism, supported by British administrative laxness, which was aimed at the extinction, not of cows, but of Bengali and Indian Muslim society. Any Muslim, like Musharraf Hussain, who thought that Hindu-Muslim disharmony could be cured by voluntary acceptance of Muslims of a ban on cow sacrifice, mistook a mere symptom for a deathly malaise. Riyazuddin Mashaddi said, and this is my translation, I stand between my country, Swadesh, on one hand, and those related to me, Swajan, on another. My ethnic community, Jati, on one hand, and my co-religionists, Shadharmo Avalombi, on another. In between them, a dispute grows, so who should I speak for? Hindus of India wish to force the Muslims and Christians to live according to their wishes, interfering in many places in their social and religious rights. A few undeserving Muslims, instigated by the Hindus, seem to think refraining from cow sacrifice and eating beef will solve all problems. O British government of India, are you blind? Your silent neutrality on governance now extends to non-interference in the torture of one section of your subjects by another community. Tell me, how are Muslims supposed to bear this attack on their faith? In imputing British preference for Bengali Hindus and demanding a national status for the Muslim community, Mashaddi was in fact asking for equal political status for Muslims and Hindus in India. But even more importantly, he was placing the right to freely practice religious faith, both privately and as a marker of communitarian identity, on par with that of racial or national belonging. This was a logical outcome of the analytic lens he used to examine the question of cow protection and the ban on beef. It is undeniable that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's poison tree was bearing fruit. The rise of the Hindu self as the only potential inheritor of Indian nationalist projects that Chatterjee had projected in his novel Anandamath was creating deep unease among religious communities against whom that self was imagined. The political logic of the use of religious differentiation, of course, ran counter to the humanitarian and pacifist logic dictated by common sense, as used by Mir Musharraf Hussain, which stressed the similarities of racial and geographical intimacies between Bengal's Muslims and Hindus. So let's come to a conclusion, because I've been speaking for far too long. What can this brief, forgotten local interlude in the history of Bengal tell us about the idioms of identity, of definition of self and community of Bengali Muslims in the latter half of the 19th century? Certainly, there is a suppressed tension in the controversy, one that pitted Musharraf Hussain, whose Bishad Sindhu was a potent symbol of the syncretic, popular, poetic version of folk Islam, against the reformist ulema of Bengal. This folk Islam was a living tradition of popular articulation and understanding of the spaces and environs of subaltern piety. The reformist sections of Bengal's Muslim intellectuals, who stressed the authority of the Quran, advocated a purge of all syncretic elements of this tradition of Bengal Islam as a necessary step towards progress and modernization. Articulated through differences of ideological engagement between the Hindu other and the Muslim self, the apologias of the kind that we see in the Shudhakar, the Akbar-e-Islamia, and the pamphlets penned by Musharraf Hussain and Mashaddi sought to delineate and ascribe primacy to the Shajati versus the Swadesh, the imagined community versus the idealized nation. By examining the use of textual analysis of customs and rituals in the pamphlets, my paper offers an understanding of the liminal spaces of intellectual discourse aimed at the Bengali Muslim imaginary, and in the process, I hope, complicates the notions of good versus bad Indians and good versus bad Muslims in the colonial India. An understanding that did not depend only on colonial classification, but also on internal divisions between Bengal's elite and non-elite, between Bengal's Hindus and Muslims, and between the Ashraf and Atrap Muslims themselves. Musharraf Hussain had to learn the bitter lesson about the increasing impenetrability of the definitions of what constituted a good Musalman in eastern Bengal of this period. The defamation lawsuit brought into sharp focus the limits of intellectual reinterpretation of Islamic texts based on common sense and contemporary socio-political needs of Bengal's Muslims. The cross-examination transcripts, with their close focus on the language used by Musharraf Hussain and his understanding of the Quran, highlight an immense anxiety about textual purity and validity of textual exegesis. The transcripts, pamphlets, and newspaper reportage point to a deep rift between the major communities of faith, which were already beginning to define self and other in adversarial terms, and this is only in the 1890s, not even in the 20th century. But the Gojivan controversy also highlights a significant rift between traditionalists and modernists within the same communities of faith, with this major difference. The traditionalists, often marginalized, posited a more liberal stance on creative accommodation of social and political differences. The close legal juxtaposition between personal libel and religious blasphemy that the defamation lawsuit presented also points to a clearer and closer association between personal faith and public political communitarian identity. Closer example on examinations of such archival ephemera, as in which have survived only accidentally, of pamphlet and periodical literature, often destabilize accepted categories of historiographical analysis of religious communitarianism and communalism in colonial India. Above all, such analysis also illumines, I think, perhaps inevitably, the tenaciously long-lived, tragic genealogies of the ideologies of national belonging and otherness defined only in religious terms, with eerie resonances for present-day post-colonial India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mo, for this illuminating historical account of an issue that we are still wrestling with in today's times. So as we were talking, I was thinking the more things change, the more they remain the same. But before I open the conversation up for general discussion, I would like to thank all of you and thank Mo again and thank our Facebook Live audience for joining us for this conversation.